Introduction. History is filled with tales of powerful kings, ruthless wars, and grand empires. But behind the curtains of royal courts, a darker reality existed, one where women were used as pawns in the ruthless game of power. These women were not queens, nor were they ordinary subjects. They were concubines, hand-picked, controlled, and often discarded at the whims of powerful rulers. For centuries, kings and emperors across the world maintained massive harems, not just for pleasure, but as a calculated tool for securing alliances, producing heirs, and ensuring their dominance. Behind the luxurious palaces and silk-laden chambers, concubines lived under constant surveillance, trapped in a life of fierce competition, betrayal, and sometimes even death. Some concubines rose to unimaginable power, influencing kingdoms from behind the scenes. Others became mere casualties of royal politics, silenced forever when they were no longer useful. The truth is far darker than most history books reveal. In this video, we will uncover how ancient kings manipulated, exploited, and even destroyed women to maintain their grip on power. Stay with us as we dive deep into this hidden chapter of history, where beauty was a weapon, loyalty was a gamble, and survival was never guaranteed. The origins of concubinage. Concubinage was not just a practice, it was a system deeply rooted in human history, stretching across civilizations from ancient China to the Ottoman Empire, from the courts of Europe to the palaces of the Middle East. But where did it all begin? The origins of concubinage can be traced back to early societies where powerful men sought multiple women to expand their lineage and strengthen their rule. In times when marriage was often dictated by politics, concubinage became a way for rulers to maintain control over women without the formalities or obligations of marriage. These women were chosen for their beauty, intelligence, or noble lineage, yet their fate was never in their own hands. In ancient China, concubines were seen as secondary wives, ranked below the empress, but often holding significant influence if they bore the emperor's children. The infamous Forbidden City in Beijing once housed thousands of concubines, each competing for the emperor's attention, knowing that a single night in his chamber could change their destiny forever. The Middle East and North Africa had similar practices. In the Islamic caliphates and the Ottoman Empire, concubines were often slaves, captured through war or purchased from distant lands. The most powerful sultans kept harems filled with hundreds of women, all living under strict rules and intense competition. Some concubines, like the legendary Hurrem Sultan, rose from slavery to become the most influential women in history. Even in Europe, concubinage was common among monarchs and nobility. Kings kept mistresses, some of whom wielded enormous political power. French kings, Russian czars, and even the Catholic popes had unofficial harems, hidden behind the walls of palaces and churches. Though the system varied across cultures, one thing remained constant. Concubinage was never about love or romance. It was about control, power, and survival. Women were used as tools for political strategy, their lives dictated by the whims of the men who owned them. And as history would show, this ruthless system would give rise to some of the most powerful and tragic women the world has ever seen. Political manipulation through concubines. Concubines were far more than just companions for kings. They were political weapons, strategically used to secure alliances, eliminate threats, and influence the fate of entire empires. Behind the lavish palaces and golden thrones, these women became bargaining chips in a game where power meant everything, and love was merely an illusion. Many rulers took concubines from noble or rival families to secure political ties. In ancient China, emperors would demand the daughters of powerful warlords and ministers to be sent to the palace as concubines. This was not just about pleasure. It was a way to keep potential threats under control. By holding a rival's daughter within the imperial harem, the emperor ensured that her family remained loyal, knowing that any betrayal could lead to her downfall. The Ottoman Empire took this strategy to another level, The infamous Topkapi Palace housed hundreds of concubines, many of whom were foreign princesses or daughters of influential men. The Sultan's favorites could use their position to advance their own family's interests. Hurrem Sultan, originally a captured slave, became the legal wife of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, breaking centuries of tradition. Her rise to power not only changed the empire's politics, but also led to brutal rivalries, with assassinations and poisonings becoming a norm inside the harem. European kings were no different. French monarchs, like Louis XIV, used their mistresses to influence court decisions and diplomacy. Some concubines acted as spies, passing critical information between kingdoms, while others manipulated the king's decisions for their own gain. In Russia, Catherine the Great, who started as a mere consort to Emperor Peter III, orchestrated his downfall and seized the throne for herself. But the stakes were dangerously high. Concubines who lost favor were often discarded, sent to distant monasteries, or in the worst cases, executed. Some were falsely accused of treason and killed simply to make room for a new favorite. The very system that elevated them to power could just as easily destroy them. Concubinage was never just about luxury and comfort. It was a battlefield where survival depended on manipulation, strategy, and sometimes sheer ruthlessness. The next part of this story takes us even deeper into the dark realities of life inside the palace, where trust was rare, betrayal was inevitable, and only the strongest concubines could escape their deadly fate. Life inside the palace. From the outside, life as a concubine seemed luxurious, silk robes, gold ornaments, and a palace filled with riches. But behind those grand walls, the reality was far from a fairy tale. The harem was a prison wrapped in luxury, where survival depended on cunning, manipulation, and an endless struggle for the ruler's attention. Concubines were brought to the palace at a young age, often as war captives, slaves, or gifts from noble families. Once inside, their lives were strictly controlled. They were trained in court etiquette, music, poetry, and even the art of seduction. But beneath the surface, they lived in constant fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of betrayal, and fear of what would happen if they displeased the king. The competition was brutal. In places like the Forbidden City of China and the Ottoman Topkapi Palace, thousands of concubines fought for a single moment with the ruler. Alliances were made and broken overnight. Women poisoned each other's food, spread false rumors, and used every trick possible to eliminate their rivals. One wrong move could mean exile, or worse, death. But even those who won the king's favor were not safe. A concubine's power depended entirely on the ruler's desire. If she bore a son, her status could rise, but if she failed to produce an heir, she was often discarded like a broken chess piece. Some were sent to monasteries, forced into isolation for the rest of their lives. Others were mysteriously removed when they became a political threat. Perhaps the darkest reality was the lack of freedom. Concubines were rarely allowed to leave the palace. They were cut off from their families, their former identities erased. In the Ottoman Empire, the harem was guarded by eunuchs, men who had been castrated to ensure loyalty. These eunuchs controlled every aspect of the concubines' lives, acting as both protectors and jailers. Life inside the palace was not about love or romance. It was a brutal game of survival, where beauty was a curse and power came at a deadly price. But for those who played the game well, the rewards were unimaginable. Some concubines managed to rise above their captivity, influencing politics, dethroning kings, and rewriting history itself. However, the cost of such power was always dangerously high. In the next part, we'll explore the true price of this life, the psychological and physical toll on the women who were forced into a system that viewed them as nothing more than pawns in a deadly game of power. The psychological and physical toll. Behind the glittering palace walls, the life of a concubine was not just a battle for survival, It was a slow, crushing descent into psychological and physical torment. Stripped of their freedom, isolated from the outside world, and forced to navigate a web of deceit and power struggles, many concubines suffered in silence, their pain hidden beneath layers of silk and jewels. The psychological toll began the moment they entered the palace. Most concubines were taken from their homes as children, ripped away from their families, and thrown into a life they never chose. They were renamed, reshaped, and reprogrammed to serve the ruler's desires. Their entire existence revolved around pleasing a man they often feared, knowing that a single mistake could mean exile or execution. Jealousy and paranoia ran deep within the harem. Women who once shared laughter turned against each other, driven by the brutal competition for the king's attention. No one could be trusted. Betrayal was common, and even the most powerful concubines lived in constant fear of falling out of favor. The psychological strain of always watching their backs, of knowing that a simple rumor could destroy them, pushed many into deep despair. But the suffering was not just emotional, it was physical as well. Many concubines endured abuse at the hands of their masters, with no way to resist. Some were subjected to cruel punishments if they disobeyed or were accused of disloyalty. Beatings, forced starvation, and even executions were common forms of discipline. In the Ottoman Empire, concubines who displeased the Sultan were sometimes drowned in the Bosphorus Strait, their bodies weighed down to ensure they would never be found. Even those who gave birth to royal heirs were not safe. If their son became a political threat, they could be forced into isolation or executed along with their child. In China, imperial concubines who bore sons that posed a challenge to the emperor's rule were often poisoned or mysteriously vanished. The endless stress, fear, and trauma took a devastating toll. Many concubines suffered from severe depression, anxiety, and even madness. Some took their own lives, unable to endure the suffocating existence. Others lived long enough to become bitter shadows of their former selves, their dreams shattered by a system that saw them as nothing more than disposable pawns. The palace may have been a place of power, but for the women trapped inside, it was nothing less than a beautiful prison, a place where hope was a dangerous illusion, and survival came at the cost of their soul. But despite all this, some concubines managed to defy the system, rising from oppression to wield unimaginable power. In the next part, we'll uncover the stories of the most famous concubines in history, women who turned their suffering into strength and left a mark on the world that could never be erased. Famous historical concubines. Throughout history, some concubines managed to escape the shadows of oppression and carve their names into the annals of power. They were more than just women in the king's bed. They were strategists, influencers, and sometimes even rulers in all but name. Their stories reveal how, despite the brutality of the system, intelligence, ambition, and sheer survival instincts could turn a concubine into a queen. One of the most legendary concubines in history was Wu Zetian of China. Originally a concubine of Emperor Taizong, she was sent to a Buddhist nunnery after his death, a fate common for discarded concubines. But Wu Zetian refused to fade away. She manipulated her way back into the palace by capturing the attention of Taizong's son, Emperor Gaozong. Over time, she outmaneuvered her rivals, eliminated opposition, and eventually declared herself the sole ruler of China, the only woman in history to hold the title of emperor in her own right. In the Ottoman Empire, Roxolana, also known as Hürrem Sultan, was another concubine who defied the odds. Captured from Eastern Europe and brought to the harem of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, she didn't just become his favorite, she became his wife, an unprecedented move in Ottoman history. Roxolana wielded enormous political influence, advising Suleiman and even engaging in foreign diplomacy. Her rise changed the power dynamics of the Ottoman court, setting the stage for future concubines to wield greater authority. Then there was Marquise de Montespan, the infamous mistress of King Louis XIV of France. Though she never officially held the title of queen, Montespan ruled the court through her influence over the king. She was the center of political intrigue and scandal, using her charm and intelligence to shape policies and secure positions of power for her allies. However, her involvement in the notorious affair of the poisons, a scandal involving black magic and assassination plots, ultimately led to her downfall. In Japan, Lady Kasuga was another example of a concubine who played the game of power to perfection. As the concubine of Tokugawa Iemitsu, the third shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate, she rose to become one of the most powerful women in Japan. She controlled the inner court, advised on political matters, and helped solidify the Tokugawa dynasty's rule. These women were not merely passive figures in history. They were survivors, tacticians, and in some cases, rulers in all but name. They proved that even in a system designed to control and discard them, intelligence and ambition could turn a concubine into a legend. But despite these few success stories, the reality remained grim for most concubines. Their power was always conditional, and their downfall could be just as swift as their rise. In the next part, we'll explore how the institution of concubinage began to decline as societies shifted away from absolute monarchies and women began to reclaim their autonomy. The decline of concubinage. For centuries, concubinage was deeply woven into the political and social structures of powerful empires. Kings, emperors, and sultans used concubines not just for pleasure, but as pawns in their games of power. However, as the world changed, so did the fate of these women. The decline of concubinage was not sudden. It was a slow and complex process influenced by shifting political systems, changing moral values, and the rise of women's rights. One of the biggest factors in its decline was the fall of absolute monarchies. As nations moved toward constitutional governments and centralized political structures, the unchecked power of kings and emperors weakened. Rulers no longer had the same freedom to maintain massive harems, and the political role of concubines became obsolete. The Ottoman Empire, for example, officially abolished the harem system in the 19th century as part of modernization efforts. Religious and cultural shifts also played a major role. Many societies began adopting more rigid moral codes that condemned the practice of concubinage. In Europe, the influence of Christianity and its emphasis on monogamous marriage made concubinage less acceptable. In China, the downfall of the Qing dynasty in the early 20th century brought an end to the imperial concubine system, as new republican ideals rejected the excesses of the past. The rise of women's rights movements was another key turning point. As societies advanced, women gained access to education, employment, and legal rights that gave them greater control over their own lives. The idea that women should be property or political tools became less acceptable. In the 20th century, many countries passed laws protecting women from forced marriages and sexual exploitation, further dismantling the institutions that had enabled concubinage. However, while official concubinage has largely disappeared, the exploitation of women for power has not. Even today, echoes of the past remain, with powerful men using wealth and influence to control and manipulate women. The concept of mistresses, unofficial partners, and coerced relationships still exists in many parts of the world, proving that while the system of concubinage may have declined, the imbalance of power between men and women is a battle still being fought. In the final part of our video, we'll reflect on the dark legacy of concubinage and what lessons history can teach us about power, control, and the ongoing fight for women's autonomy. Conclusion. Concubinage was more than just a system of royal pleasure. It was a brutal instrument of power, manipulation, and control. For centuries, kings and emperors used women as tools to secure alliances, produce heirs, and maintain their dominance. While some concubines defied the odds and rose to positions of influence, the vast majority lived lives of confinement, competition, and silent suffering. The decline of concubinage was not simply the result of moral enlightenment. It was driven by shifting political landscapes, cultural transformations, and the relentless struggle for women's rights. As absolute monarchies crumbled, societies began questioning the unchecked power that allowed rulers to treat women as property. Education, legal reforms, and changing social norms eventually made the institutionalized exploitation of concubines a relic of the past. But has the story really ended? Even today, echoes of this dark history remain. Whether through mistresses in the political world, forced marriages in some cultures, or the abuse of power in modern relationships, the imbalance that once fueled concubinage still exists in different forms. The past serves as a warning, a reminder that power, when left unchecked, often comes at the cost of the vulnerable. History is full of lessons, and the story of concubinage forces us to ask difficult questions. How far have we really come? And how much further do we still need to go? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into history intriguing, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more eye-opening content. Until next time.